If you've been tracking with our summer teaching series on the life of Joseph, you've no doubt have picked up that almost nothing goes according to plan. It's one interruption, one disruption after the next. However, what we've also learned is that somehow God is in those disruptions, and God uses those disruptions to do his course-correcting work. God course corrects for Jacob. God course corrects for Joseph. God course corrects for Joseph's brothers. God also even course corrects for Egypt. Now, does that make God some sort of puppet master? No. God is a caring father to all people, including those who insist on making every mistake possible. And so we can conclude that God's promises eventually overpower everything that gets in the way of his goodness. And that's where we're headed today in the second last installment of the story of Joseph. So this morning we're going to talk a little bit about seeing things that we didn't see coming. We'll explore the kind of justice that God is interested in. And finally, we'll identify the limitations of where our authority ends and where God's begins. So all that and more as the story of Joseph continues like this. Jacob finished instructing his sons, pulled his feet into bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Joseph threw himself on his father, wept over him, and kissed him. Joseph then instructed the physicians in his employ to embalm his father. The physicians embalmed Israel. The embalming took 40 days, the period required for embalming. There was public mourning by the Egyptians for 70 days. And when the period of mourning was completed, Joseph petitioned Pharaoh's court. If you have reason to think kindly of me, present Pharaoh with my request. My father made me swear, saying, I am ready to die. Bury me in the grave plot that I have prepared for myself in the land of Canaan. Please give me leave to go up and bury my father. Then I'll come back. And Pharaoh said, certainly. Go and bury your father as he made you promise under oath. So Joseph left to bury his father. All the high-ranking officials from Pharaoh's court went with him, all the dignitaries of Egypt joining Joseph's family, his brothers and his father's family. Their children and flocks and herds were left in Goshen, and chariots and horsemen accompanied them. It was a huge funeral procession. And when the Canaanites who lived in that area saw the grief being poured out, they said, look how deeply the Egyptians are mourning. Look how deeply the Egyptians are mourning. Who are they mourning? They're mourning an adversary. Who saw that coming? Think about what's actually happening here. Jacob is literally Mr. Israel, and he is getting the royal treatment in Egypt. What's being described here is a royal funeral. That's what Jacob is getting. The preparation of his body, the days of mourning, the processional, the dignitaries, the blessing of Pharaoh. This is the largest, most extravagant funeral recorded in Scripture. And all along, the narrator underscores for you and I the size of this funeral. He's dropping names. He's making a big deal out of this because this is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Because no one could have ever seen this coming. And what it tells you and I is that something is afoot. This isn't normal. And this could change everything. Don't you feel like we're living in one of those times right now where things are just not normal? And what has happened and what is happening makes it feel like everything is going to change? right? It's not hard to see that. The last 6 months, church and work and school and groceries, all of that has changed, and nobody saw any of that coming. Even over the last 6 months, businesses that have been mainstays, things that we just expected would be around forever, are disappearing. Did you hear that Rolex, the watch company, is shutting down? Have any of you own a Rolex or have ever owned a Rolex? I owned a Rolex once. I paid $20 for it on the St. Catherine Street in Montreal. It made my wrist green and the hands fell off by the end of the week. I'm pretty sure it was a real one. Nah, who knows? But Rolex is going under. Who could have seen that coming? Or Airbnb. They built an empire of vacation rental homes over the last 12 years. Our family has used them before. And now all of that seems like it's going away. I didn't see that coming. Did you? What about Starbucks? Starbucks has been printing money since the 1970s. But a new story recently came out that said they are closing 500 locations in the US and Canada before the year is out. Who saw that coming? I certainly didn't. Or maybe take it a step back into what just happened in the last few days. Have you been tracking with sports, or the NBA in particular? So the NBA players who are living at Disney World, let's just stop there right now. Did you ever think that every single NBA team was going to be living at Disney World? I didn't see that coming. So the NBA players are living at Disney World. It is so funny, right? Isn't it crazy? That's nuts. Thanks, Theo. You're a good helper in this sermon. NBA players who are living at Disney World, who, by the way, are playing to empty stadiums. Does anyone see that one coming? We're just going to do sports in empty stadiums? I didn't. Did you guess that NBA players who were living at Disney World, playing to empty stadiums, would boycott or perhaps create a work stoppage of their own games? Did anybody see that coming? You certainly didn't, and neither did I. Thank you, Penny. Man, the Anderson family is just on board this morning. Thanks, guys. We should keep you guys in here more often. Because it doesn't matter if you agree or not with what's going on. It doesn't matter if you're directly impacted or not. Something is afoot. Just like the grand finale of Jacob's life. Something is happening that nobody saw coming, and it's drawing attention. Look how deeply the Egyptians are mourning. No one could see that coming. So this presents a question for us this morning, and the question is this: what is God drawing your attention to these days? What's happening in your life? What's happening in our world that you just did not see coming? And what do you think God is up to in that disruption? Or maybe take it a step further. What is something completely unthinkable that God could do in your life or in the lives of those people that you love that would lead to a course correction? A way for God's goodness to gently overpower the disorder of sin and brokenness. Imagine something that would come so far out of left field that the onlookers in your life would look in and their jaws would drop and they would say, I never saw that coming. So perhaps the challenge for you and I this morning is this: will you allow God, through the disruptions that you are currently experiencing, to speak to you? And will you hear God out even if it's absolutely unbelievable? For Joseph's brothers, they didn't seem quite ready for any of it. And their story continues like this. After burying his father, Joseph went back to Egypt. All his brothers who had come with him to bury his father returned with him. And after the funeral, Joseph's brothers talked amongst themselves. What if Joseph is carrying a grudge and decides to pay us back for all the wrong we did him? So they sent Joseph a message. Before his death, your father gave us a command. Tell Joseph, forgive your brother's sin, all that wrongdoing. They did treat you badly. Will you do it? Will you forgive the sins of the servants of your father's God? And when Joseph received their message, he wept. And then the brothers went in person to him, threw themselves on the ground before him, and said, "We'll be your slaves." There is a lot at play here. Do you remember way back at the beginning of this story when God gives Joseph a dream of his brothers bowing down to him? It's actually happening right now. All these years later, it's finally happening, but the brothers still don't believe it. And what we know as the readers and what the brothers miss is that this God-given dream has been at work this whole time. And it hasn't been diminished one bit by their failures, by their moral lack, or any sort of foul play. Secondly, don't you just love these brothers? I mean, kind of in like a laughable way, or perhaps in a way that sort of pities them? Did you actually believe them here? I don't. Dad said you have to be nice to us. They're lying. Do you know how I know they're lying? I have pulled this same scam on my siblings when I was a kid. Dad said you had to give me that. Dad said you're supposed to do my chores for me. And you've done the same thing. My kids have done the exact same thing. These dudes are lying. In this story, what the narrator does for us is connect their claims here, not to historical fact. Jacob never said any such thing. He's connecting what they want to their fears. Plus, if it were true, don't you think Jacob would have spoken to Joseph himself? Of course he would have. So don't be fooled. They're not really asking for forgiveness here. They're motivated by preservation, not contrition. Because for the brothers, betrayal and deception are still on their minds. Even after the miracle they just saw, Egypt honoring Israel, the brothers miss the miracle because guilt and fear have such destructive staying power. And they're worried. They're worried that Joseph is the kind of guy that holds a grudge like they do. So they put on a bit of a show here because they're still believers in the powers of deception instead of the powers of forgiveness. And the brothers continue to deceive because they're still working under the terms of retribution. And when this hits all of Joseph, he weeps because his brothers still don't get it even after all this time. But perhaps in the brothers' defense, this might be another one of those "I didn't see that coming" moments. The brothers are expecting retribution. The brothers expect Joseph to hold a grudge. But Joseph has something else in mind. And hey, Tyson, can you take... Thanks, buddy. Joseph has something else in mind. And nobody in the story, the brothers especially, see it coming. The brothers believe that Joseph will enact a retributive justice to hurt them back the way that he was hurt. But Joseph has a different kind of justice in mind. Think of it like this. This is not a matter of ignoring justice. On the contrary, it is precisely a matter of bringing about true justice by working to repair rather than perpetuating harm. Restorative justice is a justice that works to repair. So let me ask you a question. When I say the word justice, where does your mind go? Does your mind go towards a retributive justice? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, fight fire with fire. If someone hits me, I'm going to hit them back twice as hard. Does your mind go to a justice that feeds a never-ending cycle of hurt and violence? Or does your mind go towards a restorative justice where relationships are healed? A justice where God's goodness can take over. So with all of that in mind here, let's just stop for a moment and ask ourselves, are you feeling like the brothers these days? Are fear and guilt dominating your thoughts towards the ones that perhaps you have hurt or the ones who have harmed you? Or are you more like Joseph these days? You've moved from retribution and you've moved towards restoration. Are you there? Are you on your way? Wherever you might be today, remember that God's justice is never, ever retributive. God is always working towards a justice that repairs. And when we decide to adopt God's example of restorative justice, we create a new disruption, one that draws attention to the power of forgiveness. And you know this because we see it every day. We hear it on the news. Our world lives by the rules of retribution, but God's kingdom operates by the rules of restoration. And once we come to terms with that, once we adopt God's ways as our own, it changes things. And Joseph knows this. Do you know how Joseph knows this? He knows this because he knows his place. And that's why he responds to his brothers in this way. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" When I first read this verse this past week as I was preparing, I was so struck by it that I thought, you know what, I need to read this verse in other translations just to get a really good feel of what Joseph is getting at here. So here's the same verse in other translations. It might help you like it helped me. Joseph says, "Can I do only what God can do?" Or what about this one? "Am I God that I can punish you?" One more. "Am I to judge instead of God? It is not my place." So what's happening here? Joseph is refusing to play God. Instead, he directs the attention of his brothers away from himself and towards the good Lord, who is actually in charge of their being. And how does Joseph get here? He gets here by being aware of the limitations of his authority. He knows his place. He knows his role. He knows what he can do and cannot do. And his response is based on what? On God's overriding plan for his brothers, not his personal feelings. And that right there, my friends, is another disruption. But this one is taking place internally. Think about it for you and I. Oftentimes, you and I, we lead with our feelings, right? Who do I like? Who do I not like? What do I want? What do I not want? Who's been good to me? Who hasn't been good to me? And we take all of those feelings and we use those feelings to fuel our actions. However, when we accept and know our limits, when we know our place and our role, when we recognize that it's not up to us to play God, it changes how we respond to others, in particular those people who have caused us harm. So remember, finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. You know what that is? That's another one of those, I didn't see that coming. You know what else that is? That's one big, huge step towards restorative justice. Do you know what that is? That is a recognition of our authority and our limits. And do you know what it actually is? It's another disruption. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to ask you to stand. I'm going to ask you to please put on your masks. And as we sing this last song, whose themes tie into the passage that we just spent time with this morning, I pray that you would allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you, to make you aware of things, to help you see the change from retribution to restoration, to help you recognize the limits of your power and authority. So with that, will you sing?